I'm here because my beloved son, Colton, died from fentanyl poisoning. And I'd like to promote the word that it's a real thing out there, and that a lot of people of all ages, children, adults, everybody is at risk of suffering from fentanyl poisoning. When he was born, he was my joy on wheels. I mean, he just loved adventure. He was funny. He was very, very busy. So he was diagnosed with ADHD when he was in 4th grade. He was the kid that always fell out of his chair. He was so busy that he would run and run and run, and then he would put his head down on the sofa, standing up, and he would take a nap. And then as soon as he woke up, he'd get up and he'd run and run and run and run again. So was that an indication of things to come? I don't know. And then he loved speed, and I have a picture of him that I just think it's the essence of Colton Cleveland, because he's on a sled just sliding down a snow mountain with his hair all, blown in the wind, and this big smile on his face. That was the Colton that we all knew and loved, my joy on wheels. But again, as he got older, and he did struggle in school. He was really, really smart. And I think another thing that's difficult to deal with is, you're smart, you've got it all in here, but you struggle with conventional education. And so as parents, we tried everything. And we ended up homeschooling him when he was in middle school. And that's when we really noticed a profound decline, where he really, really was trying to keep up with the other peer group. He really wanted to be part of the popular group. Well, he was popular, but for some reason, he just decided that he needed more to keep up with his peer group. But as time progressed, Colton was diagnosed as having bipolar disorder when he was only 16. So we really felt that the marijuana addiction was probably driven by his underlying bipolar disorder that we didn't know about. So that can affect people in so many different ways. Some people are healthy, some people take medication, eat well, and they exercise vigorously, they just have healthy habits. But others, I believe, like my son, just get that initial high or wonderful feeling, whether it's a calming feeling or the absence of anxiety or whatever it is, and then they progress. And then by the time my son was turning 17, we had to put him in his first rehab situation. It was Christmas time. He was about to turn 17, and we placed him at Visions in Malibu. And I would say it was a really great program. The great thing about the program was all the families of the people involved, of the children involved, because these were all minors, had to spend a week at the Betty Ford Clinic. And I highly recommend that any family dealing with any kind of substance use disorder or addiction, I highly recommend that kind of family counseling, because I thought we just had a regular family. We ate dinner together every night. My husband was really good. He worked very hard, long hours, but he always left his office and came home and had dinner with the family. And then if he had to, he'd go back to work. He read to our kids every night. So I felt like we just had a regular family. I will acknowledge it was an upper middle class family, so there were certain privileges involved because that first rehab was extremely expensive. And what I've learned along the way is my son was actually out of a variety of rehab and sober living situations. And unless you have great medical insurance or a lot of money, it's very, very hard to find the right kind of care for your loved one. We did everything that the counselors told us to do with regards to, not enabling and not giving him money and not doing anything, but he was still on this roller coaster cycle. And the reason I bring that up is because every time he entered rehab, he left with another thrilling new temptation to try. Now, that was his choice. He did it on his own. But if he heard somebody else's story, it drove him to try something new. And he continued to spiral downward. And then my husband started to spiral downward. Eventually, he passed away, way too young. And I know that affected my son, and I know he was lost without his dad. And I did my best to be mom and dad. And he had mentors. We have a great family. My family's wonderful. I have a sister, 2 brothers. They have spouses. They have kids. My parents were alive at that time. And my husband's side of the family didn't have kids, but they were loving people too. And so you think all of that is going to help build a young man of good and noble character. You do your best, but then drugs take hold. So every time he came out of rehab and decided he wanted to try something new, before long it was really an opioid addiction, a severe opioid addiction. So whether it was OxyContin or Codone or whatever, or Percocet. Oh, and he discovered Xanax too. And all of those things, when he used them maybe once or twice, they did relieve some of the anxiety and the depression that he was developing. But again, there was that underlying bipolar disorder. And then you've got psychiatrists prescribing medication that's usually good for people. But then when you have someone who's struggling, they don't want to take the time to let the medication work, because time is forever when you feel too depressed or when you're in a manic phase, which is very, very scary, and you can't stop and you can't sleep. So I know that that propelled his drug use. And the more he used, then the more he required. And then we tried to explain to him that a lot of those drugs, especially Xanax, they can create the very symptoms that you take them to relieve. So before you know it, you're taking so much of whatever it is, and then all of a sudden you're having anxiety, panic attacks, or you're feeling very depressed, so you want more and more and more. My sister and I dropped him off at a rehab in Huntington Beach, because this was all starting in California. And we told him, look, your choice is going to rehab, or you don't have to, but I'm not bringing you home. And I think that was one of the worst days of my life, because I knew I left my son in a situation where if he decided to leave, he was on the street. But that's what they tell you, you know, in Al-Anon and in recovery situations and in family therapy. They say, kick him out, leave him on the street. Well, guess what? My son did leave after a couple of weeks with no money, no phone, and this was in Huntington Beach, California, right when the COVID pandemic isolation was getting started. Somehow, he made his way to Texas, and from Texas, he made his way to Colorado. And he always wanted to live in Colorado, and he did live there several times. How he made it, I will never know. The hardest thing was when he would call me and say, Mom, I'm really thirsty. Can you buy me some water? Send me money so I can buy some water. And I would tell him, no, just go use a public faucet. Well, guess what? All the restrooms were closed during COVID. So it wasn't like you could go to a restaurant room and just go on in and help yourself to water. He was really, really stuck. And then he would call me and he would say, Mom, I'm really, really hungry. And by calling, sometimes he would go to like a 7-Eleven or something, and he would ask to use someone else's cell phone. And he would say, Mom, I'm really hungry. And I would have to tell him, go to the food bank. And this broke my heart, especially because food is my thing. I love to cook. I love hospitality. And to be able to have to tell my son, no, I'm not going to give you money for food, broke my heart. But I knew it was the right thing to do. And again, it was during the COVID pandemic. Everything was shut down. So somehow he survived. And that propelled him back into another rehab situation in Colorado. So it was this constant roller coaster of rehab, and then sometimes sober living, and then going back to rehab, trying to be sober. But I really feel like after a certain amount of time, his brain was so altered that when he was in an ICU, he'd returned to California, and when he was in ICU, I asked the psychiatrist, like, does he have a death wish? Is he trying to kill himself? And the questions they ask, I think, are engineered so that they don't have to hold you. I don't think anybody really wants to hold you on anything. And all I wanted was for my son to be held and placed in a safe place. But the psychiatrist told me the wisest words I have heard through this entire journey. And he said, Mrs. Cleveland, whatever choice you make, whatever decision you make, you need to be okay with the outcome. And that's when I went back and I thought, okay, well, they all say in recovery, it's okay to keep a roof over their head and food in their stomach for them to have a safe place to live. So I did bring my son back into my home the last few years of his life, and I watched him cycle. I watched him suffer detoxing by himself, and it was a true suffering process. And then he would try to be sober. He would try really hard to be sober, but it was very painful for him to be sober. And then again, the psychiatric medication that would have been prescribed never gave him that relief that he needed, and the pain over a period of weeks was too much, so he would go back. So he did find fentanyl. He was introduced to fentanyl when he was in a rehab in Thousand Oaks, California. He met a couple of girls that were in the girls' home, and he was in the boys' home, and one of the girls turned him on to fentanyl. And ever since then, which was about almost 3 years ago, that became his drug of choice because it was cheaper than heroin, it was cheaper than the oxy pills, Percocet, and it was easier to come by. We moved here to Tulsa, Oklahoma, just over a year ago, January of 2023. My daughter has been here for quite some time, and I thought it would be nice to be close to my daughter and her husband and maybe experience something a little different. And he really wanted to renew his relationship with his sister. His sister's 16 years older than him, so we always thought that was God's sense of humor because we were older parents. I was 43, and my husband was 45, and we thought, okay, we've got this new adventure now and not as much energy as we used to have, but it was a joy and a delight until all of the drugs interfered. So when we moved back to Tulsa, he had a great job that he ended up losing because he ended up using drugs again and not being able to show up. And so I knew he was finding drugs in the neighborhood, and I don't know how, because I had a rule that he couldn't bring anybody in my home, and I will say he broke the rule early on. Shortly after we moved, he did invite somebody into my home, and I told the guy, look, I'm an old lady, I go to bed early, so when I'm ready to go to bed at 9, you're out of here. And I thought they left. And somehow the guy came back in our room, and Sunday, that guy was still at our home. And my son said, he knocked on my bedroom door, he goes, Mom, Chester collapsed. And I said, call 911, you deal with this. I'm not doing anything, because I thought it was probably a drug overdose. I didn't know, but I decided actually, my son overdosed 8 times in my presence, and I was able to bring him back with Narcan. So I knew he had Narcan, and I figured he could handle this. The paramedics came. They don't know what happened to that guy. He was fine when they took him away, but the paramedic looked at my son and said, what are you doing bringing somebody like this into your mother's home? And my son said, well, we just moved here to Tulsa. I was just trying to make friends. And the paramedic shook his finger at him and he said, the best way to make friends is to go to church. And so I hadn't found a church yet because I was still streaming my California church online. And it was a Sunday, and I said, well, Audacity Church is around the corner. And, you know, here in Oklahoma, there's a church on every corner. So when you're tied to a church out of state and then you come to a place where there's so many churches, you don't know where to go. But I said, we're going to Audacity. They have an 11 o'clock service. We showed up, and by golly, the sermon was the perfect thing for my son to hear. He went up to the altar. He cried. He met the care pastor, Hank Grant. He loved the pastor, Ronnie Baker. He met the Murray family who participate in the Celebrate Recovery group. They all embraced him. So we really thought that this was the turning point and this was going to help. But again, the fentanyl was just pulling him. And so he was sober for Thanksgiving, so he could have a sober Thanksgiving. 2 days later, he overdosed on fentanyl. But fortunately, I had Narcan, and he came to. The church people came over. They tried to talk to him. We thought that maybe this was it, that finally this was it. But no, he made it through Christmas. And then on December 26th, he found fentanyl again, and he overdosed again. And fortunately, I had Narcan, so I was able to bring him back. And I finally thought, okay, this is it. And then on the 27th, my daughter and I just left like for an hour and 20 minutes for a yoga class. And before I left, I looked at him and I said, are you going to be okay? And he said, yes. He had just gotten a plate of Christmas leftovers, and he said the best part about Christmas is leftovers. And I thought it was going to be okay. And when I came home, I ran upstairs where he lived, and I found him collapsed on the floor. And I tried Narcan, but it was too late. I called the paramedics. My church pastor came over. We prayed, and it was just his time. And I think Colton was ready to go home. That's the one thing that brings me peace, is knowing that this terrible trial is over for him. I know where he is. I know he's at peace. He is in a better place. I don't think you should tell anybody who loses a loved one, oh, well, they're in a better place. I don't think that's the right thing to say to somebody who's lost a loved one, but in my case, I really do know, without a doubt, that he's found his home.